Today we're going to talk about sectionalism. Do we have a sign-in sheet going around? We should. Will you?
Do we ever have one going on?
No, because I never think about it, but today I did because half the class was here. So I guess you'll get 10 points extra credit on quiz 2. Would you write that at the top?
Wait, how many?
10.
Ooh.
Some of y'all, and probably not the ones who are here, are not here. Yes, probably not those of you that are here. Some of y'all will be needing 10 points on quiz 2 after what happened on quiz 1. Have I not published this class's grades yet?
No.
Okay, so that'll get done this afternoon. I'm about 2/3 of the way through with this class then.
So it was hopefully a different class than that felt that badly.
Yes, those were worse, yes. This class was doing a little bit better. And again, those of you who are here, I'm not real worried about, but the ones that are not. Anyway. So, we'll define sectionalism, obviously talk about what that means, and what it means specifically in the context of America's westward growth. As you can see, by this period, by the end of this period, America will have added a lot of new territory to its national border. And it is beginning to fulfill what some would have called its manifest destiny. Sort of extension of that language of natural rights and the natural way of things that argued it was American destiny to have a nation that stretched from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific. Obviously, inherent in that would be an extension of what had been done up to that point to Native Americans. And we'll talk some about that, but also, you have an America that at this point is failing to heed the warnings and words of George Washington in his farewell address where he said, don't fall into geographical factions. That's what has happened. The North and the South with what I'll call competing visions about what America should look like as it grows into the West. You have the South envisioning America in its own image as an agrarian republic with plantation owners and enslaved labor growing cash crops, an extension of its own slave society. And you have a North that envisions an America that is instead committed to manufacturing and a diverse economy. And where slavery, as with the Northwest Ordinance up here, is not allowed to expand west. Keep in mind, last time what we saw, expansion into what we now call the Midwest or the Old Northwest, slavery was banned. Indian removal and expansion into the Deep South or the Old Southwest, slavery expanded. So we have those two precedents and what will apply as America grows into these western territories.
This is something that I just thought of. Was the South focusing entirely on cash crops and eventually destroyed the fertile land because they didn't know about, because crop rotation wasn't discovered until decades later?
It becomes a problem in the old tobacco regions first, which makes sense because that was the original cash crop production region where they did, after harvest after harvest after harvest, you deplete the soil. Like you said, they don't fully understand crop rotation to the extent of not just leaving fields fallow, but planting things that would rejuvenate the soil. And by this very time, in fact, this is in play here. When we've got these 4 factors I think I left off with last time, just kind of breeze through really quickly. And some additional factors that would include exactly what I was just saying, that when Indian removal, number 1, from this area, the Deep South we now call it, the Black Belt, expanded settlement, including an expansion of slavery, at a time when, yes, up here in the old Chesapeake or Tidewater regions, tobacco market is on the decline, the field's not producing as much. Some of those plantations have mass excess of slaves. They sell those slaves down to merchants who bring them to slave markets in Tuscaloosa, Montgomery, Jackson, Mobile. And the people who move into these areas can now purchase at slave markets slaves to settle in what would become plantations growing cotton. So what are the other major factors besides just Indian removal? The beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. The beginnings of industrialization, first in Britain, And then in the northern American states, the beginnings of industrialization lie in the textile industry. The world's first factories were textile mills. It allowed a few people to use new machinery, looms, that were powered initially by like water wheels, but eventually by the steam engine, in order to produce way more cloth or fabric than any individual could have before. Prior to this time, the go-to material in the textile industry was wool. But thanks to a technological innovation, factor 3, that is going to cease to be wool and become cotton. Technological innovation in the form of the cotton gin. Cotton gin makes it significantly easier and more efficient to separate out cotton fiber from the seed and stem. And finally, the realization, once Indians were removed by force from this area and white Americans began to settle there and accumulate slaves, they realized the soil and the climate of the Black Belt are perfect for growing cotton. So Indian removal and expansion of slavery with a very lively domestic slave trade is number one. No longer even had to import slaves from abroad. The slave population was growing at such a rate in America itself. But then 2, beginnings of industrialization. Cotton is the go-to material in the textile industry, so demand for cotton increases dramatically. Thanks to, in part, the cotton gin, which was another factor. And then finally, this perfect climate and soil in this region known as the Black Belt turns out to be the ideal space for growing cotton, of course, on the backs of the enslaved masses. Now, I know I mentioned here before what it means to be a slave society. That's what the South has become by this time. That is a society in which everything, in one way or another, is affected in some meaningful way by slavery, by this institution that is chattel and racial slavery. I'll give you one example. Look at the slave markets and look what's happened. You have people going into these markets, and as one historian has put it, imagining who they could be by literally imagining who they could buy. Remember, in a chattel system, you have the commodification of human beings, the essence of which is a person with a price. Consider then the yeoman farmer, the sort of Jeffersonian farmer who's going to be able to buy some land in, say, Alabama. He envisions one day, accumulating some money, some wealth, and being able to purchase a slave. And therefore move up in society and be able to say, I am a slave owner. Used to just be the average yeoman farmer, and now I'm a slave owner. I have moved up the social ladder. Consider then maybe somebody who moves into the region already owning 2, 3 slaves. They imagine moving up in the world by going to that slave market and purchasing 2, 3, 5, 6 more slaves. Maybe one day when they get older, they are considered a planter, not just a slave owner, but they have accumulated something like a dozen slaves. And they don't just have a farm where they have to go out and work alongside the enslaved. They can chill in the big house and have overseers oversee those 12, 15, 20 slaves out in the field. They have moved up the social ladder by purchasing slaves. Consider, though, that person, or maybe they bequeath that to their son. That person imagines over time going again and again and again to slave market or markets, plural, and one day being like the planters of the Low Country, having a plantation with 300 slaves that you don't even live on. You live in Charleston or Savannah, and you have people run that massive plantation for you. You have moved up to the very top of the social ladder by doing what? Purchasing slaves. So when social mobility, when moving up in society is tethered directly to buying other human beings, that is an example of what it means to be a slave society. And you see that in these slave markets. This is more what I was kind of waxing on at the very beginning slide. I'm talking about those competing visions for America. Sectionalism means America has developed into two distinct geographic sections with different interests, with different societies. South is a slave society. The North is not even any longer a society with slaves. The northern states had all outlawed slavery. And as I said, we've seen both of those sections of societies grow into what had been formerly Western territories. The Northwest Ordinance banned slavery from the Great Lakes and Midwest region of the Old Northwest here. Slavery was allowed to expand into the Deep South here and here. And people are beginning to talk about that manifest destiny. What if one day some of all this, which is occupied by Native Americans but claimed by Spain, and eventually becomes the nation state of Mexico? What about all that up there in the Northwest that is simultaneously claimed by the U.S. and by Great Britain? What about the remaining Louisiana Purchase territory that hadn't been settled yet, most of it? What's going to happen as America grows inevitably west and west and west, as some people believed it would? Would it grow in the image of the South, or would it grow in the image of the North? Would the West become like the South in an agrarian, plantation-based society where a mass of slaves produced cash crops? Or would it grow in the vision of the North, the image of the North, and be a diversified, industrializing economy with free labor? Consider something else, too. And I'm going to skip this sub-bullet and go right here. This is very important. At this time, Jackson has created his Democratic Party. It's very powerful, but it had a lot of enemies, opponents. As the original two political parties break down and become eventually irrelevant, the old Federalist and Jeffersonian Democratic Republic, a new party emerges directly in opposition to Jackson's Democrats, and that is the Whig Party. So that's your two political parties, the two main ones. Here's the most important point of the first half of this lecture. These are national parties, both of these. These are not sectional parties. One of these is not the party of the South, and one is not the party of the North. Does that make sense? Meaning there are, at this time, Northern Whigs and Southern Whigs, and there are Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats. At a time of increasing sectionalism, these national parties are the cords that are holding the country together. As long as you have these national parties and there is some measure of working together across the geographic divide, the nation is held together. When these national parties break apart, that's when we begin to see the United States break apart and we're getting towards civil war. But we're not there yet. So look at this, just to underscore this. This is the Electoral College returns from the presidential election of 1844. At that time, the Whig candidate for president was Henry Clay. Henry Clay was a senator from Kentucky, so it makes sense that he won his home state along with neighboring Tennessee and North Carolina, southern states. But he also won Ohio, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Jersey, northern states. The person who won this contest, Democratic candidate James K. Polk, won New York and Pennsylvania and Michigan, but also the Deep South in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina. That shows you there are Northerners and Southerners in both parties. And also, too, note we have a few new states and territories by this time. Speaking of which, at that moment, there was, roughly speaking, in Congress, in terms of the number of senators and representatives from the North and South, so setting aside for the moment party, but if we're looking at senators and representatives in the Senate and the House, there's a roughly equal number of Southern ones and Northern ones, which means there geographically is a balance of power. And the thing that you work through for your interest are your national party. What we're going to see, though, increasingly during this period of sectionalism, there are certain issues that come up, excuse me, where senators or representatives will break with their party and vote with their section, meaning sometimes issues will come up where Southern Whigs and Southern Democrats vote together, and Northern Whigs and Northern Democrats vote the other way. Does that make sense? That would involve anything that threatened to disrupt the geographical balance of power, like, for example, the addition of a new state to the Union. If a new state comes in, this is the big question. Will it be a slave state or will it not? That's the number one key question here. If we add new states, meaning if you settle those western territories that have become actual states, are they going to be slave or are they going to be not slave? Meaning we have two new southern slave state aligned senators and however many representatives depending on population, or will we have two senators that are more northern in their interest, not slave, and also however many representatives? That could tip the balance of power, and when these kind of sectional issues come up, one section could outvote the other every time by that phenomenon of breaking with your party and voting instead with your section. So there's an interest in maintaining the balance of power. So here we are in 1820, we'll back up. Finally, enough people had settled, this is the old Louisiana Purchase territory. Enough people had settled on the western bank of the Mississippi and along the Missouri River to the point where a territory was created there, and Missouri Territory, and by 1820 was ready to petition to become the state of Missouri. You with me? Not really. So the question is Missouri going to be slave or Missouri going to be free? Many of, if not most of the people who had settled there were slave-owning farmers who had brought slaves with them. So it made sense that Missouri needed to, unless you're going to have a big disruption, come into the Union as a new slave state. But what do you do about the balance of power? Well, you could add another free state. And that is the first provision of the Missouri Compromise. See way up there in the corner? That northeastern portion of the United States prior to this time, even though it is geographically separated by Vermont and New Hampshire, was still part of the state of Massachusetts. And that's clunky and weird to have a non-contiguous state. So the thinking was, well, we got to add Missouri as a slave state. How do we balance that out in Congress? Let's just make Maine its own state. And that's obviously a free state. There are no slaves up there. So provision 1 of the Missouri Compromise was to create the state of Missouri, which came into the Union as a slave state, but to simultaneously add Maine as a new free state in order to maintain the balance of power. What is provision 2? And provision 2, I will say, is much more important. You see the red line there. It is an extension of the southern border of Missouri. At 30 degrees north latitude, 3630 parallel. Extension of the border of Missouri to what was at that time the western border of the United States with the colony of New Spain about New Mexico. The second provision of the Missouri Compromise says above that line, accepting obviously Missouri, which just came in as a slave state, above that line, if new states ever come into the Union from that Louisiana Purchase territory, they cannot be slaves. No more slave states carved out of the Louisiana Purchase. So effectively, 3630 is a ban on slavery north of that line, with the exception of the brand new slave state of Missouri. Now, you might think to yourself, well, that's going to be a shitload more free states that could totally destroy the balance of power. And while that's true, nobody was thinking any of that territory was going to be settled anytime soon. Now, eventually it might. So what you can say about the Missouri Compromise is they pretty much knew this was a temporary compromise.
It seems from every action taken after it that no one in the South thought of this as like a real law that existed. Like basically that this was like the equivalent of a non-binding agreement in the House of Representatives.
Yes, and what's astonishing, what we're going to see is the person who makes it that, or essentially makes it no more, is actually somebody from the North who knew he would get Southern support from people who had, for the past at that point, 30 years, had that exact same mindset. So everybody knew this was a Band-Aid, all right, metaphorically. This is just put this on there for now, and we'll see if it festers or if it gets better. Who knows? Just stop the bleeding for now. We'll see what happens. Interestingly, the more immediate concern, and I know we've gone forward 20 plus years, getting to the 1840s, but the more immediate concern becomes another portion of territory. Mexico obtained its independence from Spain, and the old colony of New Spain that becomes the brand new nation of Mexico includes not just what is today Mexico here, but all of Texas and all of this. Think about, up to this point, we've got states that are either English monarch names or English people names or Indian names. Out here in the West, these are all the Spanish named states. There's a reason for that. So this includes California, Colorado, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico. Those are all those modern day states here. This is a large amount of territory that America is about to acquire. How? Yes. So, let's back it up. Here, and again, envision initially when Mexico first becomes independent, all of this is part of Mexico, including Texas, and including also over here what we call East Texas. If you look at a topographical map, or not topographical, satellite view, you can see that's the really fertile part of Texas. Much of the west is desert or close to it. It's also where the big cities of Texas are: Houston, Dallas, Austin, San Antonio. I don't even have to go to satellite view; you can just see it there. So this is the heart of East Texas. I emphasize this because at one point, the Mexican government encouraged Anglo-white people, that is Americans, or even going back to Spanish colonial times, the Spanish government, including white American settlers, British colonists, to come over and settle in this region and to engage in cattle ranching and cash crop farming using slave labor. So the point is, in the heart of Texas, if you will, there were a lot of white people. And Anglo-descended people as opposed to Spanish-descended people who, turns out, don't really see eye to eye with the brand new Mexican government down in Mexico City. They fight a war for their independence from Mexico, which eventually they win, becoming for a brief moment the Republic of Texas, an independent nation state. They don't stay that way very long, though, because they petition pretty soon the United States to come into the United States, the American Union, as a new state. They petition to be annexed, in other words, into America. The next domino to fall is that the United States government, the Texans, or the Tejanos, and the Mexican government don't agree about what was actually conceded when Texas won the war for its independence. In other words, they don't agree where the border is. And all of this is disputed territory. And particular down here by the coast, where the United States and the Texans argued the border ought to be the Rio Grande, and the Mexican government said, no, we only ceded to the Nueces River here. And so both sides send troops, those troops end up shooting at one another, and we have a war between the United States and Mexico over the border of Texas. A war that goes back and forth for a little bit, but eventually the United States is able to win by sending a naval expedition down to Veracruz and marching on and occupying the capital city of Mexico City. And then more or less forcing the Mexican government not only to give up the disputed area of Texas, but all of this as well. Everything from Texas to California. Unlike with the Louisiana Purchase, there's not a several decades long period where you say, we just acquired this, but not a lot of people are going to settle there. It's going to take a while. The Indians have control of a huge portion of that. Why is that? What's different about this? One thing is that if we focus specifically on California, or this western portion, Native Americans there had long been subdued by the Spanish. And there were already Spanish descended, lately Mexican farmers living in that area who were about to be dispossessed of their land by Americans. But there's one other thing, and this is 1848, 1849. Any NFL fans? San Francisco's football team, the 49ers, harkening back to 1849. Almost immediately when the United States acquires this territory, gold is discovered in California. And then eventually silver too. And people flock out there from the older portions of the United States to try to, speculate, grab up a plot of land, go out there and hope to God there's gold on it and you can get rich really quickly. And so again, unlike with the Louisiana Purchase where it takes some decades for these newly acquired territories to consider applying for statehood, almost immediately the debate is up about what's going to happen with California. There then ensues a debate about what to do with not just California, but the rest of what becomes known as the Mexican Cession. Remember, cession is like ceded, signed away. The Mexican government signed away that huge blue chunk of land. What are you going to do with it? And remember what I said earlier, the key question is, will slavery be allowed to expand there or not? So, let's look at the main arguments in that debate. Some people said, well, we've got this 3630-degree line. It's kind of like, if you think about it, going all the way back to the Mason-Dixon line that separated Pennsylvania from Maryland, which then was extended by the Northwest Ordinance along the Ohio River, and then we dipped down below Missouri and we extended it to 3630. Why not just extend it all the way to the Pacific? Above that, no slavery. Below that, slavery. Seems easy enough. That's not what they did. Some people, become known as free soilers, argued that slavery ought to, as with the Northwest Ordinance, be banned from the whole thing. Let me make one thing clear. Unlike some people that we will look at here in a minute, these people are not abolitionists. They don't care about slavery in the South where it exists. They don't care about the enslaved. What they are worried about is that it would be unfair if those areas would be open to slave owners moving out there and bringing their slaves or acquiring slaves at market like they did in the Deep South, that for the average non-slave owning American farmer who tried to move out there and start up a farm, that would make it immeasurably more difficult for that person. That it would be unfair for the average white American farmer to have to compete with slave owners and their slave labor. To put it another way, the mere existence of slave labor somewhere devalues average white labor and makes an unlevel playing field for the more, not even necessarily poor, but average yeoman type farmer who does not own slaves. These people's motto was free soil, free labor, free men. So they become known as the free soilers. Free soil, free labor, free men. They also do not win the debate. John C. Calhoun, long-serving senator from South Carolina, and a slave owner. He argues the exact opposite, and that is that the entire Mexican Cession ought to be open to slavery, all of it. And he makes an argument here that while it also does not carry the day at this time, is going to eventually become very, very influential. And he points to the Fifth Amendment of the American Constitution to make his argument that slavery ought to be open in the entire Mexican Cession territory. Why would he point to the Fifth Amendment? And this is not the part of the Fifth Amendment that you would invoke in a deposition or trial to avoid self-incrimination. There's another part. You know what it is? Fifth Amendment's like a John Locke classical liberalism amendment. The Fifth Amendment says, no person can be deprived of their life, liberty, or property. Remember this? It's the important rights that Locke says the government should protect. No person can be deprived by the federal government of their life, liberty, or property without the due process of law. Meaning there is a legal process to which you are entitled or due before the government can take away your life, your freedom, or your property, right? Meaning unless you've been convicted of a crime, I mean, in that case, you might lose your freedom or your life or your property. If someone has sued you and won in a court of law, then maybe your property could be taken. That's the legal process to which you are due or entitled. What does that have to do with slavery in the Mexican Cession territory?
For one, they looked at slaves as their property, so they fell under property.
Bingo. Chattel system of slavery, in legal terms, slaves are property. Ergo, says Calhoun, if you do what the free soilers want you to do, and you ban slavery from here, and I want to move out there and bring my slaves, and I can't, isn't that depriving me of my property without the due process of law? Remember that. It's not going to win the day here in this debate, but remember it because it's going to come back.
Wait, if you bring, like, I don't want to call people contraband, but like that's, if it's illegal.
Funny you say that because in the next lecture, that is exactly what we're going to do.
Yeah, no, like it'd be super illegal to do that. The federal government's job would be to stop you.
Right. It becomes a federalism question, a question of what's more sovereign, the federal law or the state law.
But yeah, like no, it's just like this is the one thing that everyone agreed on. The federal government regulates everything to do with travel between states.
Right. That's going to be a counter argument. That is precisely the counter argument to Calhoun's point here, and it's also the counter argument made when this Calhoun Fifth Amendment argument comes back up. So it's a very good point. Now, what actually ends up happening? A compromise is engineered. And I would say if you read about this in the textbook, there's a lot of other things swirling around. I'm going to try to focus just on the Mexican Cession here. But they had so many slavery-related issues that needed resolving. They're like, who the hell can we look to in Congress to figure all this out? They look back to Henry Clay. Clay, I mentioned, runs unsuccessfully for president at one point. He'd been in the Senate for a long time. He was actually the author of the Missouri Compromise. So like, hell, Clay figured it out 30 years ago. Let's see what he can come up with. And the result is the Compromise of 1850. Make sure when you get ready to take quiz and exam, you can differentiate the Compromise of 1850 from the Missouri Compromise of 1820. So what does Compromise of 1850 do? For our purposes, and again, it does a lot more than this, but for our purposes, number one, California comes in as free. Made sense anyway, you just added Texas as a slave state. What about the rest of the Mexican Cession, which again would encompass the modern day states of Arizona, New Mexico, parts of Colorado, Utah, Nevada? They are divided into two sort of huge super territories, the Utah territory and the New Mexico territory. Those territories are then opened up to popular sovereignty. Popular is in the people. Sovereignty is in the authority or power to decide. Meaning, and somewhat to your point a second ago, take the power out of the federal government's hands and put it into the hands of the people who actually settle in those territories. When they move there, they can vote for people who will sit in a new territorial or state legislature. Those legislatures will then draft and approve constitutions that either can include slavery as legal or that can outlaw slavery. So you put the power into the hands of the people who settle there to decide the issue as opposed to the federal government. Does that make sense? This is another sort of band-aid temporary thing, and it gives both sides hope. Southerners thinking, well, you know, slavery has marched forward in the South, on and on and on. It would just keep continuing to do so. anybody ever been to or flown over like New Mexico or like northern Arizona? It's not exactly the Great Plains or the Deep South. It's a lot of desert and mountains. So other people are thinking, I mean, is slavery really going to expand out there when we don't exactly have like the most fertile soil and so on? So both sides are thinking they can carry the day.
Is this the idea that leads to Bloody Kansas?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it absolutely is. So when we talk about John Brown here in a minute, that is precisely the situation, the state of play. Although we're not quite there yet. Questions, other questions? So let's go there. That individual at top right is Stephen Douglas. Maybe you haven't heard of Stephen Douglas.
He opposed Abraham Lincoln in his election.
And who won that election? Well, okay, let me back up. Who won the first election that pitted these two against one another? So, I'm glad you say this because this is exactly my point. Everybody knows Abraham Lincoln. I mean, he's very young there, so maybe you didn't immediately recognize him, but they are both from Illinois. Douglas is a Democrat, Lincoln is a Whig. At this point, Lincoln is kind of, to put it bluntly, just kind of a nobody. He serves a term in the House of Representatives, decides to run for the Senate, has a big campaign against Douglas, and Douglas wins. So Douglas is an influential senator, and at this moment, and I'm not being deliberately coy or derogatory here, Lincoln is a loser at this point. So Douglas is the great man in the Democratic Party. And in 1854, he's very much concerned with infrastructure, what we might call internal improvements, as they would say at that time. Specifically, America is industrializing, particularly in the north, but even in the south, you start to see the building of railroads to transport goods and people. In California, with the gold rush and the growth of the city of San Francisco up here, you begin to see the development of railroads for carrying minerals, raw materials, goods, products, whatever. But there is nothing connecting the railroad network over here with the one in California. So one of the things that Douglas really commits to is the issue of building a transcontinental railroad. Now let me jump back to this map, though, in talking about this potential for a transcontinental railroad. So this becomes a sectional issue. All right? How or why is this so? All right. Over here, almost everybody would agree that in California, the railroad would start going east from San Francisco. Los Angeles didn't exist yet. San Diego is a little bitty town at that point. It was clearly San Francisco, right? But the other question is, where's it going to connect over here? And do you see how this becomes a sectional issue? Southerners are like, man, bring it this way from here, go through the cattle ranches of Texas, and then maybe either you could dip up through here and bring it to St. Louis, which is on the Mississippi River for transportation of goods, or just go straight to the mouth of Mississippi in New Orleans. But Douglas is from Illinois, so where does he want the railroad to connect in the east? The major city of which is what? Which at this time goes from being nothing to being this great hub right here of this entire region, Chicago. So if you're Douglas and you want that railroad to run from San Francisco to Chicago, where's it going to run through? The Louisiana Purchase Territory, which is held by the United States in theory, but which is controlled by the Sioux and the Apache and all of these other Native American groups. You cannot build and maintain a railroad through territory you do not actually control. So, what you would have to do to make that a reality is organize those into territories, send out a government, a governor with a militia, and establish some measure of control, which would involve, of course, wars with the Indians. But what else would it do? Do you remember earlier when we said Missouri Compromise? Doesn't that carry a lot of maybe negative potential for the South? If these become territories, they are governed by Provision 2 of the Missouri Compromise. Meaning when they become states, they're all going to be free states. And that would destroy the balance of power in favor of the North.
Oh yeah, they're not trying to have it.
Exactly. So how in God's name would Douglas from Illinois get Southerners in his party and in the opposition party, the Whigs, to support him in not only getting an eastern terminus of Chicago for the Transcontinental Railroad, but in actually organizing the remaining Louisiana Purchase territory into formal territories and then states? How did he do it? By suggesting to them that the law that would do all of this could repeal the Missouri Compromise. The Kansas-Nebraska Act creates the two super territories of Nebraska and Kansas and includes a specific repeal of the 3630 ban on slavery north of that line. Meaning, Kansas and Nebraska could then be left open to popular sovereignty, just like Utah and New Mexico. Meaning, you had for 34 years up to that point, had a law that said no slavery above this line if we ever move into it and make it states. Now that's gone. Now people are going to start moving into there. And when they do, they get the ability to either vote to ban slavery, or more likely in most people's minds, particularly in the case of Kansas, to vote to allow slavery to expand there. So just like this, with the passage of this law, and you had a massive area of territory from which slavery was banned, in which it is no longer banned. Does that make sense?
I was confused on which office he held, because he wasn't a president.
Douglas is a very influential senator.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Who's president 54? It's not. No, it's about to be James Buchanan, who was right before Buchanan. And I don't want to guess and be wrong and be totally discredited. Pierce. See, I get to say, see, I was going to say Pierce. Of course it was Pierce. He took over for Millard Fillmore. But you can see Pierce is a Democrat too, so Douglas has his own party in control of the presidency, and that is, of course, important. Let's talk about the effects and the significance of this, though. If you, and we did this with the Revolution, so I mean, you really shouldn't do this as a historian, because always the story is more complicated, but it makes it more teachable, in my opinion. But if you wanted to take a single event and say, we can connect the dots, we can draw a line from that event more or less directly, in this case to the outbreak of the Civil War, this could be the event. It's going to take 6 years, and a lot happens, but what are the seeds here? What can we look at in terms of effects and significance and begin to see that argument? So first of all, we already know the Missouri Compromise is no more. Obviously, the first part of it stands. Missouri is still a slave state, Maine is still a free state. But when we say repeal, we're talking about that 3630 ban is gone. Created 2 new territories, super territories. They're now open to popular sovereignty, meaning the people who move there can decide to become slave states if they want to.
What acted Douglas to get the territories again?
His key in getting support for this was in telling Southern senators and members of the House, support me in the Chicago terminus thing, and we'll have a bill that will provide for creating these 2 new territories, and we will specifically repeal the 3630 ban. And they're like, oh, slavery could expand. Sounds good to me, Senator Douglas. Now, people who are enraged by this include a few members of his own party, but most especially Northern Whigs, who are also deeply upset at the Southern members of their own party who voted for this. Among those individuals is Douglas's old opponent, Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln and other Northern Whigs decide at this point to leave the Whig Party and to join forces with two other factions in creating a brand new political party.
I know what the Democrats believe at this time, and like how they got their origin. Like, what on earth did the Whigs care about? Because I've looked at the British Whigs, I've looked at Whigs across multiple governments, and I have zero clue what their deal is.
Yeah, their deal is two things broadly. One is just flat out opposition to Jacksonian, Democratic Party. They inherit a little bit of, if Jackson's party inherited the more states' rights, anti-federalist, Jeffersonian mantle, the Whigs try to revive that old federalist support for federal authority, more power to the Fed, less for the states. Specifically in doing things, this is a deep irony too, by the way. One of the things they were really gung-ho about is internal improvements, which is using the power and money of the federal government to build railroads, to build bridges, to build roads and turnpikes. And here is Douglas in the Democratic Party doing exactly that. But that also shows you how he got Whig support, particularly in the South. So, that being said, if we could look at the Whig Party as maybe not exactly having a cogent set of principles or policies.
Maybe that's why both of its opponents in America and Britain still exist and it doesn't.
Exactly. So, in this case, Northern Whigs decided to join forces with two other factions to create a brand new political party. What are those two other factions? One, Free Soilers. Those people who supported banning slavery from the Western territories, not because they were morally concerned with slavery or anything like that, but simply because it was unfair for the average white American farmer. The third group is what was at that time a relatively small group of individuals, abolitionists. Those people who were morally opposed to slavery, and not just its expansion, but its very existence in the South.
And I think we see like what happens when you get a very small block that is very, very dedicated.
Yes.
That tends to push you over a lot more than you think it would.
Yeah, and it's a group that's going to, in these next 6 years, grow pretty significantly and become much more influential. So, the Republican Party is formed as a coalition of people who all, despite their varying different beliefs, are all opposed to slavery's westward expansion. So don't tell me the Republican Party was a coalition of all people who were flat out anti-slavery, because some Northern Whigs weren't. The Free Soilers weren't necessarily. They just didn't want it to expand into the West. Not all abolitionists, but they all would agree that things like popular sovereignty, opening up these territories to a potential expansion of slavery was wrong. And they could all agree that repealing the 3630 ban was wrong. Lincoln goes on a speaking tour flat out enraged about this, saying, how could you possibly take a compromise that had held us together on this issue sectionally for 34 years and just throw it in the trash? And so we see the demise of the Whig Party and the birth of a brand new party. Remember what I said when I introduced the Democratic Party and the Whig Party as national parties. I said these are the cords that are holding the nation together sectionally. One of them just broke. And now, in its place, what has emerged is not a national party. No Southerner at that time was going to join or be a part of or vote for the candidates of a party that was committed to preventing slavery from expanding. Most people in the South, white people in government, believed that slavery had to expand in order to survive. So we have replaced a national party with a sectional one, and that's a problem.
Oh God, have you heard about the Golden Circle that was part of the, later got told of the Confederacy plans?
Remind me.
It was a plan by some of the planter elite to conquer downwards to get around the Missouri Compromise and later just direct Northern opposition during the Civil War, just to basically turn the entirety of South America into a slave-labor utopia.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and there was a lot of push during and after this time to try to, get control of Cuba or other islands in the Caribbean that would be suitable for the expansion of American slavery. Actually, remember that, because there's a lot of conspiratorial thinking that we're about to see, too, in both the North and the South. Questions? Well, let me add to effects and significance here, what you brought up earlier. We've got 2 new territories. Missouri Compromise is gone. 3630 ban is gone. One national political party is dead. A new sectional party has taken its place. So we've covered all that. I want to add 2 things. One, this is going to eventually begin to break the Democratic Party up. Now, we know it survives because it's still around, but there was a moment where it looked like the Democratic Party might break too. And in fact, temporarily, it does break. So that's one other thing. And then finally, what we're about to see is a settler-on-settler, low-grade Civil War prelude in Kansas, where pro and anti-slavery people who were flocking to that territory start murdering one another. So we have the outbreak of violence connected with this as well. Settler-on-settler warfare in Kansas. Pro and anti-slavery people begin killing one another. I'll walk you through how this unfolds without holding you to the sort of specifics. And I'll kind of come back around to what is important. A lot of slave owners, similar to what you saw with Missouri, start immediately flocking into Kansas. Kansas is in the Great Plains, breadbasket of America, fertile soil, flat, arable, logical extension for slave-based agriculture. And close nearby to other slave states like Missouri. People who were against slavery expanding responded to this by paying for non-slave owning families to move to Kansas and to set them up so they could outnumber and outvote the pro-slavery people. And everybody's got guns, you know. So this is a volatile situation. Yeah, right? Everybody's got guns, volatile situation. All right, now. What ends up happening, and again, I'm not going to ask you to give me back these details. An election is held, the pro-slavery candidates sweep the election. The anti-slavery people argue that the election was fraudulent.
Which was actually a thing that could happen back then.
Sure, much greater chance for that back then. But setting aside whether it was or not, what ends up happening is both sides claim to be the rightful government. Like the anti-slavery people say, no, that was a BS fraudulent election. We're the rightful winners. We're going to set up a legislature here. They draft a constitution that bans slavery. The pro-slavery people are like, screw you, we won. We're the legitimate legislature. We're going to draft a constitution that allows slavery.
They just do what they want.
Right. Both sides submit their constitutions to Congress, by the way, and that turns out to be the one thing that really begins to divide the Democrats. Because Northern Democrats in Congress obviously think you should accept the anti-slavery constitution for Kansas. Southern Democrats think you should accept the pro-slavery constitution for
Now
Kansas.
I see why you did what you did when you telling the story, because it's a real long story.
I'm trying, I promise. And while that's going on, the pro-slavery people actually arm themselves and ride into the town where the anti-slavery people had set up their legislature, and they sack the town. That's an old medieval term for you destroy a lot of the town, right? And I think like one person is killed. I don't mean to diminish the death of a human being, but that's a small sliver of what's about to come. At that time, a dedicated, some would say radical, but dedicated lifelong abolitionist, a white man, but a lifelong abolitionist named John Brown, takes an armed group of his own and retaliates for what the press called the sack of Lawrence by initiating a raid on some pro-slavery settlers and killing like a good number of people. And there's retaliation for that. And then there's retaliation for that retaliation, and on and on and on. And you see, within a matter of weeks, the territory of Kansas is again in a state of sort of low-grade settler-on-settler warfare. 6 years before the outbreak of the actual Civil War. The newspapers start writing about it, calling it Bleeding Kansas. At that time, Another lifelong dedicated abolitionist, a senator from Massachusetts named Charles Sumner, gets up on the floor of the Senate and gives a speech denouncing what the pro-slavery people in Kansas had done, calling it a crime, the crime against Kansas. Sumner, S-U-M-N-E-R is his name.
Like Fort something.
That's got a T in it, so that's a different guy. Right, exactly. We'll get there in a moment. Charles Sumner is an abolitionist senator from Massachusetts giving a speech talking specifically about what was being done in Kansas, but also waxing much more broadly and just about slavery in general. And he starts calling out like slave-owning members of the Senate directly and like mocking them and talking about them and saying, "You and your harlot slavery." Harlot means what? Yes, whore, prostitute. So talking about slavery in those terms at that time would be not just a way for a guy who's an abolitionist to talk about how terrible slavery is, but also a not so subtle way of suggesting that his fellow senator was one of those slave owners that had sexual relations with his female slave, which would be dishonoring that individual in the Southern Code of Honor. That individual happened to have a nephew who was sitting at that moment in the House of Representatives on the other side of the Capitol when people come in and like, man,
No, he said.
Sumner's over there dishonoring your uncle on the floor of the Senate.
I forgot that was real proper back then.
And this guy over in the House, the names aren't important, he comes over and takes a cane and attacks Sumner in his chair on the Senate floor and beats shit out of him, very nearly to death. He survives, but it was dicey there for a minute.
Oh, that's
why we
him?
have a
Okay.
giant.
I was like, dang, he looked like he got beat up.
Yeah, this is Sumner getting beaten by, his name is Preston Brooks, but a guy from the House who came over to defend his uncle's honor. Butler is his uncle's name. And yes, if you've ever seen the Senate, the desks are pretty close, and like Sumner's on the floor getting beat, there's not really anywhere to go, so it's like repeated blows to the head. It's shocking that this happens on the floor of the United States Senate. The press has fun with it by calling it Bleeding Sumner, connecting it to Bleeding Kansas, but I mean, in reality, members of Congress start showing up armed with guns and knives because you didn't know what the hell was going to happen on the next day.
This event would extend Senate floor violence all the way into Teddy Roosevelt's time.
Yeah, well, Roosevelt kind of liked it, I think, right?
No, it was actually done by segregationists and the people he hated the most.
Good point.
But this is actually why we have a giant mace in Congress. The implication that if you tried this, and it went too far, that they would just...
Somebody going to grab the mace?
Yeah, no, the person in charge of keeping order in the House would just bash your head in.
Fun, fantastic. That's some medieval stuff going
The
on.
mace is still there.
Is it really?
Yeah.
I did not know that.
It's never been used directly.
Well-
It's only at people, but not hit people yet.
That's crazy. I never knew that.
After the fact, don't they send Sumner like canes in the mail just to disrespect them?
Yeah. A little get well card for you. But it's funny, Sumner, I mean, really, at least temporarily, has the last laugh. We'll see, though. A couple more things when we got 9 minutes. So, that's the state of play in Congress. That's the state of play in Kansas. What's the Supreme Court have to say about it all? President, by the way, is noticeably absent. James Buchanan, I think I've alluded to this before, maybe it wasn't in this class, but somebody asked about historically presidents and who's the best or the worst, and they actually poll historians on this question regularly, and most of it stays the same. Washington and Lincoln are always near the top, along with FDR.
That was his class.
Huh?
That was his class.
Okay, yeah. So the point here is that routinely occupying at least two of the bottom 2 or 3 spots are Andrew Johnson, who we haven't talked about yet, but will.
After Lincoln, right?
Yes. And James Buchanan, who's president at this moment, because he basically did nothing to stop any of this from continually devolving into where we know it goes. But what about the Supreme Court? As you know, the Supreme Court will take, as I said before with Marbury versus Madison, a narrow issue and use that case to make a much broader pronouncement. And the narrow issue here is that of Dred Scott. Now, for Dred Scott himself, as a human being, his life and his freedom are not narrow issues. But his is a singular case. He's a slave who was born in Missouri, but who traveled for most of his life with his owner/master in free state, like Ohio and Wisconsin, and who married a free woman and had children. And when his owner-master died, he had discussions with that person about, when you die, you can be manumitted, but that hadn't been formalized, and he was inherited by that owner's daughter who did not want to manumit or set him free. But he filed a case in federal court, arguing that he ought to be able to obtain his freedom. Huh?
He already been free. So.
Well, that was his argument. It was exactly the argument that he made. But the daughters crossed around and, hey, on paper, you're my property, and so, sorry. The case goes all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and there are three components to the decision. First of all, the Supreme Court, which, by the way, most members of the court, most justices of the court at that time were not only pro-slavery, but in the case of the Chief Justice, just out and out, biologically racist. Yeah, Roger Taney is his name. Yeah. And that'll make sense when I tell you Provision 1, they say, Dred Scott is a black man and therefore not a citizen because he's black.
Literally, that's their argument.
And they could have stopped there. They could have said, they did say, you don't have standing to bring a suit, to file a suit in a federal court because you're not a citizen because you're black. The implications of that being huge, at that time there were a great many free people of color in the northern states, and the court has just said, you're not citizens. But because they wanted to weigh in on these bigger issues of the time, they took it 2 steps farther. They said, number one, just for the sake of argument, if we did consider your case, the ruling would be Missouri is your home state, it's a slave state. That combined with the fugitive slave law and other things determine that you are always a slave. It doesn't matter where you went. It doesn't matter where you lived or started a family. It doesn't matter if your wife is free, your kids are free. It doesn't matter what vague promises were made to you. That's it. Then they make the third component of the decision, which is, let me say for our purposes in this class, I stress this because it's the end of a long lecture and people forget it all the time. This is the most important one. This ties it all together. The court in Dred Scott takes the opportunity to say, while we're talking about the status of slave property moving about the country, let us say Congress does not have the authority to ban slavery in the Western territories. Congress, says the court, does not have the constitutional authority to ban slavery in any of America's Western territories.
So that basically just outruled
So
the whole thing.
that
That's the case.
I want to say that the only thing America's territories are governed by is Congress. Nothing else.
Right.
If you say and you don't have that Congress doesn't have the authority to pass laws over territories,
I know.
then literally no one does.
Let me say, to your point, that legal scholars, there are some outliers in the last 20, 30 years. For a long time, legal scholars consider this to be probably the worst decision in the history of the Supreme Court. But let's just tie it all together. What was their basis for making that decision? They argued that if Congress were to do that, that would be depriving slave owners of their property without the due process of the law, which would be a violation of the Fifth Amendment. I told you this argument would come back. They used Calhoun's Fifth Amendment argument from several years before to make this pronouncement. And let me ask you, at what point in this lecture, and in this case the last 40 years, did Congress pass a law that banned slavery from Western territories? second component of the Missouri Compromise, 3630 ban. Now that doesn't exist anymore, right? At that point, but what had outlawed or what had repealed the Missouri Compromise?
Yeah.
So what has the court done here? They stepped into the hot button issue of the day and they just put their stamp of approval on the Kansas-Nebraska Act.
Literally. And
They just said the Congress was correct to repeal the Missouri Compromise and pass this law right here. So you have the third branch of the American government coming in while the president's not doing shit and saying Congress was correct to do this. So that's going to be the milieu, if you will, when John Brown returns to the scene, but further east. And I'll save it for next time. But the final point is, people in the North think to themselves, the anti-slavery expansion people in the North, like Lincoln, or free soilers, or certainly abolitionists, are thinking, what's really happening here is that slave owners are getting people into important positions of authority, like the Chief Justiceship for the Supreme Court, so that they can actually not just help slavery expand into the West, but turn the whole country into a slaveholding republic. Because what's the logical extension of this argument?
it's basically like this property itself.
You take yourself, well, if the federal government can't stop you,
Didn't they still have that thing like if you about the slaves and each head that you get like extra land or something like that?
no, the head right system was no longer in place, although I bet you some people would have loved to revive it for the Western territories. But, and to that point, the thinking in the North starts to become, there's a conspiracy, they call it the slave power conspiracy, to where they're going to start saying the federal government can't stop me from taking my slaves to Massachusetts or New York or anywhere because of this argument. And that what they were really trying to do is turn the whole damn country into a slaveholding republic. What we're going to see next week, is when John Brown quite literally attempts to start a slave revolution in Virginia and comes relatively close to starting to succeed, which is the greatest fear in the hearts and minds of Southern white people. They start to think conspiratorially, because if Brown is going down trying to start a slave revolution, Brown is an abolitionist, right? What political party do they now identify with? Republican Party. I mean, now it's in Ben. The abolitionists are one of the three factions that started the Republican Party. So what happens when that party gets their guy elected president? That's going to lead to the first wave of secession, because they're thinking, man, these people are literally trying to kill us. Okay, that's it for today. Thank you for your patience and for being